everyone. My name is Lisa Phillips. I'm the Director of Research Policy with the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences, and I'm a law professor at York University's Osgoode Hall Law School. And just before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that we're gathering here on the land this afternoon on the lands that for thousands of years have been the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the New Credit, and thank them for sharing their land. I want to also just tell you a little bit about the Big Thinking series, because that's what we're doing. We're having a Big Thinking lecture. This is a signature program of the Federation, and its purpose is to bring humanities and social sciences research to a wide audience of thought leaders to inform public policy. We hold about 6 of these a year on Parliament Hill, and they are very well attended by MPs, by policy advisors, by NGO leaders, and others. We also hold them outside of Ottawa. Here is a good example, also at our annual Congress of the Humanities and Social Sciences. And for those of you who haven't yet heard, this year's 2017, or the next 2017 Congress of the Humanities and Social Sciences is going to be held right here in Toronto at Ryerson University, May 27th to June 4th. So watch out for that and block your calendars. It's going to be fantastic. So this afternoon's Big Thinking lecture will address an issue that concerns many of us, the relationship between education and citizenship. And perhaps it's going to challenge some of our assumptions and our thinking about the goals and outcomes of post-secondary education. And we're very lucky to have with us Dr. Joel Westheimer. Joel is a University Research Chair in Democracy and Education at the University of Ottawa. He's also the education columnist for CBC Radio's Ottawa Morning and Ontario Today shows. He began his career as a summer camp director and then a middle school teacher in New York City. He then went on to obtain eventually a PhD from Stanford University before we recruited him to Canada. His newest critically acclaimed book is What Kind of Citizen? Educating Our Children for the Common Good. He is prolific. He lectures widely. He's delivered more than 200 keynote lectures. He's the author of more than 75 academic articles, books, and book chapters. He speaks nationally, internationally, and he's currently co-directing something called the Inequality Project, which is looking at how schools in North America talk about and teach students about inequality. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Joel Westheimer to the stage.
Okay, welcome. This is a tough time slot. It's the last session of the conference. They wanted me to do this closing one. I'm going to be provocative for this last session. My son, how many of you have kids? Okay, some of you probably know those Magic Treehouse books. You ever seen those? You know, they go, my son, when he was younger, he once asked me, we were reading the Magic Treehouse books together, and we were talking about them going into the treehouse and looking at the pages, and then they get transported to these places. And my son, Ben, all of a sudden, asked me a question, but he don't understand, like, how do they get, and I started to answer his question and explain this whole thing to him. And in the middle of my answer, Ben got up and walked away. And I said, Ben, where are you going? I haven't finished answering your question. And he said, but Daddy, I've finished listening. So I've always remembered that because I do a lot of speaking now, and I want to tell you that if you finished listening before I finished talking, it's okay, I understand. I'm used to it at home, and it happens, right? I think it was W.H. Auden who said that a professor is someone who talks in other people's sleep. But I'm going to try not to be that professor, okay? I want to address today a kind of provocation, which in some ways, I guess, could have been at the very beginning of the conference, but it's interesting to have it as the closing end piece because I think it will bridge to the next time people are gathered in this kind of gathering, and also it'll be something that you might take with you home. But let me start, before I even tell you exactly what I'm going to talk about, you know a little. I mean, the general outline is that I want to talk about the role of K-16 education in fostering democratic citizens, right, in education for the public good and that mission. But before I do that, let me just do a little thought experiment with you, okay? I sometimes ask people to close their eyes when they do this, but I'm not going to do that here because you may fall asleep. So just keep your eyes open, okay? And imagine that you are sitting in this room, but all of a sudden your chair shakes a little, and you rise up out of your chair. It's magic. This is a thought experiment. And you go through the ceiling of this room. You go up through the rest of the floors of the hotel, up out of the ceiling, out of the roof of the hotel, up into the air, into the sky, into the atmosphere, up into the stratosphere. Boom, you're in space. Okay? The Earth is turning below you, and you're up there, and it's peaceful, and you can breathe because this is a thought experiment, remember? And the Earth is turning below you, and you're up there for a peaceful little while. And at some point, after you've had time to contemplate the meaning of life and other great things, at some point, you start to descend through space. You come back through the stratosphere, the atmosphere, the sky, boom, 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 come through a ceiling, and you land in a classroom somewhere on the planet Earth. Now, here's my question for you. Would you be able to tell whether you had landed in a classroom in a democratic country, say Canada, I used to say the United States, I'm really not so sure anymore, France, or whether you had landed in a classroom in a totalitarian dictatorship, or a religious theocracy, or a military-led, junta-led dictatorship? Okay? Would you know? In some ways, it sounds like a facetious question, right? Because most of us would like to say, of course. I mean, the way we educate here in Canada has very little to do with the way a student in North Korea or China or a religious theocracy would be educated, right? So of course it would be different. But when you think about it, math, chemistry, a foreign language, the life cycle of a glowworm, right? All these kind of things might be very similar in a classroom anywhere around the world. And in fact, if you think about it, quite a lot of students' education would be quite similar in a classroom around the world, right? So then that, to me, begs another question, which is this. What, if anything, should be different in our classrooms in Canada, whether in grade 2 or grade 8 or grade 10 or first year of university or third year or graduate school? What should be different in classrooms in a democracy, in a democratic society, than in, for example, an autocracy? Right? Well, I think a lot of things, and a lot of the things that came up today, in fact, in some of the sessions, I wasn't here yesterday, so I can't say, but maybe they came up yesterday too, would come to mind. I've heard the word critical thinking said a lot today. I've heard creativity. Right? I've even heard good citizenship. Okay? And good citizenship is interesting. I don't think there's a school in the country at any level that doesn't have something about citizenship in the mission statement, right? I know the mission statement is that thing that you've never read, but every institution has one, and every 10 years we make another one that no one's going to read, right? But we have that. Good citizenship is always there. Now, every country cares about good citizenship, right? I've done a lot of research on what citizenship education programs look like in different places within Canada, within the United States, and around the world. And one of the things, that's actually what the book that Lisa mentioned is about, and I'm not going to go into detail in that now, but one of the things that I can tell you, one of the punchlines is that a lot of people in educational institutions define good citizenship as being a nice person, right? Showing up to work on time, don't do drugs, don't litter, help an old person across the street, help out in a storm, pay taxes, vote. Okay? All of these things are what being a good citizen, the kind of people you'd like to live next to, right? Like, you know, good people. The thing is, back to my thought experiment, there's not a leader of any country anywhere in the world that wouldn't want its citizens to be nice people and to help an old person across the street and to pay taxes and to help when help is needed and not to litter and don't do drugs and all those lessons. So a lot of what we teach in schools about being good citizenship is about being a good citizen in one sense of that word, but has almost nothing to do with what it means to be a good democratic citizen. So what do we expect Canadian schools to teach young people, youth and young adults, and even little kids about life in Canada? One of the things that I think we need to do is teach them that there is not one given truth, right? One version of facts or one person to follow as a leader and not question. In fact, one of the hallmarks of a totalitarian society is this idea of one version of truth, right? If Kim Jong-il said it, then that's the truth. Now, you might go home in the privacy of your living room and debate that, but in the public schools, that's the truth, right? It's given to you, and there's one version of it. And you're not expected to participate in the decision-making that's going to affect your lives because there is a military junta or a group of wise men or one religious leader to make those decisions for you. In a democratic society like Canada, we expect citizens to be able to know how to participate, how to look at multiple perspectives on things, how to be informed about those perspectives, and then make decisions and take action to improve their lives and the lives of people around them. It goes back to that Thomas Jefferson quote, which I'll paraphrase badly, but is something like, if the people are not well educated enough to govern their own affairs, then the solution is not to take that power of governance away from them. Right? That, ladies and gentlemen, was the founding purpose of public education in Canada and the United States. I know this is hard to believe, but it was not about creating job training institutions. It was not about providing skills for the workplace. It was not about fostering well, it was about orderly behavior, right? But it was not about career training. And in some sense, it wasn't even about skills in the way that we sometimes now talk about skills. And it certainly was not about competing in a global economy. Okay? There is actually no research whatsoever that shows a relationship between what type of pedagogy or what we do in a classroom and the health of a national economy. There is a correlation documented many times between whether people go to school, who goes to what level of school, and what percentage of the population graduates from high school, university, and so forth, and the health of the economy. But what goes on in school and what we should teach, no correlation. Okay? The mission of public education in Canada and the United States, the historic mission, the ideal, I don't know if it ever reached this, was to educate people so that they could govern their own lives, right? So that they could figure out their place in the world and what role they were going to have in helping to make history. And many of us still talk about those goals. In fact, they're in those mission statements that I talked about, right? Citizenship, civic participation, youth engagement, all of those words that we hear. But we've lost the ability to talk about those themes, at least in any way more than rhetorical or lip service, because we've been hijacked by an education reform movement that sees education as little more than job training. And I've heard speakers before me talk about the difficulty or even the lunacy in trying to teach the skills right now of a job that someone's going to have in 20 years or even in 6 years because of the inability for us to know, first of all, what field they'll actually end up in, and second of all, what any of those fields that they might end up in will look like, right? Technologically, socially, politically, and so forth, right? So instead, we've all talked a lot about this, and I heard it in table conversations too. Universities are supposed to provide these foundational skills, attitudes, habits of mind that allow people to function at a high level in what is often called the 21st century workplace. 21st century learning is a big buzzword in my field, by the way, in education. And it's always, I never really know what it means, but it seems to have something to do with the information economy and what people need in the information economy. Yet in school reform, especially at the K-12 level, that's often translated to mean that people need a lot of basic skills. They need math and literacy skills to function in this new 21st century economy. They need a lot of facts. And it's weird because we all carry these devices around with us every day that have instant access. I can find out any fact I want in 4 seconds, right? So we're not suffering from a lack of facts. We're suffering from an overwhelming deluge of facts. And what we need to teach people is how to look at those facts, how to make sense of those facts, how to look at different perspectives and evaluate them and have them reconcile with our worldview and make choices about that worldview. Now, I am not a higher education policy expert. I deal mostly in K-12 schools, although I do now deal somewhat with higher education as well. But I'll tell you why I like talking about higher ed. It's because I carry with me a crystal ball. Because history shows that what happens in the K-12 sector slowly seeps its way up to higher education. And so in some ways, I sometimes feel like one of these characters from a dystopic sci-fi novel, you know, the guy who goes back to the future and, you know, sees the future and then comes back and says, "I've seen the future, it's horrible, don't go there, it's terrible, right?" Well, I've been to the K-12 future, and I know what's coming to higher education. And in fact, it's already here, okay? In K-12 education, what we now see is a myopic obsession with testing in math and literacy, 2 subject areas, to the exclusion of everything else. Okay? Across the US states, across the Canadian provinces, and in much of the world. Pasi Sahlberg, the Finnish educator, calls this the Global Education Reform Movement, which stands for GERM. And he says that this germ is infecting school systems all over the world. They pass it from one to the other. And I'm telling you that K-12 education is passing it to higher education, as we see the curriculum in higher ed narrowed away from the humanities, the social sciences, and so forth, and focused only on bottom line, measurable, accessible metrics where we can tell what's going on. Right? The word of the hour in K-12 education is standards. And there's nothing wrong with that word, right? I've never met a teacher or a professor who doesn't have standards. Everyone has standards. And by the way, everyone also feels accountable, right? There's accountability. I mean, teachers feel accountable to the students, to the parents, to the principal. You know, professors feel accountable to their students. Almost never to the university administration, but to other people in society. Everyone has standards and accountable. The word standards is not a problem for me. The problem is that that word standards very quickly becomes some English person will tell me what this is. It's a related word, right? Standardization. And standardization means literally making everything the same. It means that I can take one teacher or professor from one classroom and put them in another classroom and have them switch places, no one will notice. Right? It means making everything the same. And it's done in the name of, well, if it's not the same, how could we measure it? Right? How can we know if good learning is going on? Okay? But schools and universities are not supposed to be like McDonald's. I do like my Quarter Pounder with cheese standardized. If I get it in Ottawa or I get it in Vancouver or I get it in Chicago, I know exactly what I'm going to get. But when I ask people who their favorite teacher was and who they learned the most from, or their favorite professor, I have never heard someone say, "Oh, you know, Mr. Smith, he taught biology. He taught in exactly the same way as every other teacher in the country was teaching, and he was my favorite." No one says that, right? You zero in on the teachers who draw on their own passions, their own expertise and experiences, their students' expertise and experiences to make learning come alive. And university education, of course, is not where K-12 education is in that regard. We expect university professors to teach from their own experiences and their own perspectives. But more and more I see initiatives coming down the pike that look a lot like the K-12 initiatives that want to narrow the curriculum to standardized, measurable measures of success in a smaller and smaller band of subject areas, right? We don't need philosophy. Sorry, Sandra. We don't need history. What we need is computer science. We need things that seem to be marketable and sellable now, but most importantly, not marketable and sellable, just accessible, right? That we can measure it. That's the situation we've seen in K-12 schools, and in K-12 it's exaggerated because it's down to now 2 subject areas, and of course even within those subject areas, math and literacy, it's not like, you know, there's no math teacher who says, oh yeah, the math test, EQAO, by the way, that stands for Educational Quality Accountability Office, which is a very Orwellian name if you ask me. Kids in Ontario call it Evil Questions Attacking Ontario. There's all kinds of other great translations of it. But anyway, EQAO testing tests in math and literacy, and there's no math teacher who's going to say, oh yeah, the EQAO test, that captures everything I teach in my classroom. Right? No, teaching is a very complex human endeavor that is about relationships between the teacher and the student, between professors and students. And it's very hard to get it in the narrow boxes that make it easily measurable. And so how did we get to this place? There's this story about a guy, maybe some of you have heard this. He's on his hands and knees, and he's looking for his keys. He dropped them. He's under this street light, and he's looking, and this woman comes by, and she says, what's wrong? Did you lose something? Can I help you? And he says, yeah, I lost my keys. So she gets down on her knees. They're looking for the keys together, and they're looking for like 10 minutes. And she says, are you sure you dropped them over here? Because we've been looking for 10 minutes. We haven't found them at all. He said, oh, no. I didn't drop them here. I dropped them on that corner over there. And she says, well, why are you looking here? And he says, well, because the street light is here. I think this is what's happening to our assessment-driven reforms in education. You see, education researchers are pretty good at measuring whether 2 + 2 = 4 and whether kids can say that. They're pretty good at measuring whether kids can decode the words of a sentence and understand its basic meaning. Testing technology is in its infancy. We're not so good at telling whether schools are developing the capacity for imagination and creativity, critical thinking, or the capacity to be in healthy relationships, to love someone or to be loved, or to be engaged citizens, or to find meaning or wholeness in their life, right? We're not so good at that. So what happens is, just like the guy looking under the streetlight, because we have a light shown on math and literacy, we can't measure everything we care about, those other things, right? And we do care about those things. But because we can't measure those things we care about, we start to care about the things we can measure, the things that are under the streetlight. And so it's not that assessment is bad, or even that these accountability measures are intrinsically bad. The problem is that the assessment tail is wagging the school reform dog at every level of the system. And now in higher education, we are beginning to see initiatives to try and standardize curriculum across various subject areas so that they can be tested and compared from one university to another or from one country to another. We see this already with PISA scores in K-12, to make these measures, right? And we love measures. We're human beings. We love these, right? The Fraser Institute publishes rankings of schools, and I'm looking for a school for my kid. I say, oh yeah, this school got a 9.2, and this other school got an 8.9. Oh, it's great. My job's done. I send my kid to the 2 school, right? It's better. Well, those measures or those rankings, they don't mean nothing. They mean something. They're this little piece of what a school does. Right? But we know that that doesn't represent everything that goes on in a school. It represents very little about what goes on in a school. It's something. Those kids can take those tests well and do well on them, right? But it's just a little something. And we also know from research, even though we don't get to hear about this in the media headlines, that those measures are not a proxy for other things that kids learn in the school. In other words, it is not true that schools that have higher test scores also necessarily are accomplishing great things in the idea of teaching kids independent thinking or creativity. And in fact, sometimes it runs in the opposite direction, right? They're inversely related, but they're certainly not positively related. We have lots of cases of schools in poorer, working class neighborhoods where the test scores have doubled and tripled. Okay? And schools, elite schools in elite neighborhoods, in wealthy neighborhoods, where the test scores have gone down. Why does that happen? Well, that happens because parents in wealthy neighborhoods don't put up with the idea of a curriculum narrowed to months and months of test preparation and skills and drills to be able to take those tests to the exclusion of learning the violin and music and everything else, right? So dramatic is this emphasis that we now put on these test scores. Let me just give you one quick example. Let me read this to you. How many of you are familiar with school breakfast programs in either Toronto or where else? Ottawa has a school breakfast program. It feeds 8,000 children breakfast every morning, and who would otherwise, who come to school hungry. And it's a terrific program. I know a lot of the people who work there. I was looking at their website, and they have a Q&A, and one of the questions is, why is the school breakfast program important? And I'm going to give you their answer. Children who arrive at school hungry do not perform well in the classroom. Numerous studies have shown that students who are fed are more alert, develop greater self-esteem, have better attendance, and fewer discipline problems. Children who receive a healthy, nutritious head start to the day show a marked improvement in academic achievement. Gosh, it wouldn't be enough if we fed them because they were hungry, right? We have to feed them because it's going to raise their scores on standardized measures of assessment. I mean, what more basic moral imperative is there than feeding hungry children, right? This is how insane we've gone down this road. And by the way, I'm a social scientist. As a social scientist, I am wondering, who is the control group in these studies? Are they taking a group of kids and putting them in a room and starving them? Of course these kids do better. They're fed. I mean, and we get these crazy things like school districts finding out that gum chewing during these standardized tests raises test scores. And so there's a school in Illinois now that has mandatory gum chewing while students take tests, right? So it's kind of like we've all gone crazy, right? And what I'm most worried about, though, is not the narrowing of the curriculum per se, but the degree to which that is a threat to Canadian democracy and to Canadian civic life. And it's a threat because as we create little automatons who regurgitate information on basic skills of tests, even as our rhetoric, and I know the rhetoric is there for engaged learning and creative thinking and so forth, but we have lots of research that documents the direction that education is going. And that is a threat, ultimately, to independent thought, critical thinking, and ultimately democratic life. So what does this mean for higher education? Let me read you this quotation from the mission statement of the University of Toronto, right near here. Within the unique university context, the most crucial of all human rights are meaningless unless they entail the right to raise deeply disturbing questions and provocative challenges to the cherished beliefs of society at large and of the university itself. It is this human right to radical, critical teaching and research with which the university has a duty above all else to be concerned. For there is no one else, no other institution, and no other office in our modern liberal democracy which is the custodian of this most precious and vulnerable right of the liberated human spirit. That encapsulates language that is difficult to come by anymore, right? We can argue about the degree to which University of Toronto follows this mission statement, but it's there in the mission statement, right? And I am concerned that school reform goals, both at the K-12 level and increasingly higher education, are at risk of running in exactly the opposite direction of those goals and towards the notion of pure job training and job preparation, as many people have documented today, a misguided mission in and of itself, but also one that threatens democratic life in Canada. Maxine Green is an education philosopher at Teachers College at Columbia University. She died 2 years ago. She was 96 years old. She was a close friend and a mentor of mine. And she said this about education. She said, "The purpose of education is to comfort the troubled and trouble the comfortable." And of course, right, I love that because of course schools and universities have to provide safe spaces where kids can learn, where they can become comfortable in their ability to gain employment later on, all those things that we care about for sure, right? There's no question about that. But they also, and always, in a democratic society, need to be places where we trouble the comfortable. In other words, where we ensure that kids and young adults ask tough questions about us, about the world around them, and about different multiple perspectives that they're going to see in the classroom. And I worry that we're crowding that out of the curriculum. And I think that if we reflect on that kind of mission statement that the University of Toronto has, and you can find it on their website, we can try and at least begin to recapture some of the language that formed the initial purpose of public education in Canada, which was to foster the common good and to develop a public engagement and public life that created a nourishing society for all those in it and involved all of our citizens in improving that society. And that's a goal that I think should be held above all else in our educational endeavors. Thank you.
Well, you promised to be provocative, and I think that at a summit for skills and PSE, you achieved that objective, Dr. Westheimer. I do want to open up the floor to questions. We have roving microphones. Maybe I could, I'm not even going to invoke my chair's privilege. There's a hand up immediately. Yes, right here.
Thank you. Thank you for that very insightful and thought-provoking speech. I was wondering, in your opinion, what jurisdictions are doing a good job in the K-12 system of fostering the common good or building good citizenship?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question. What's your name?
Safa Zaki. I'm with the
Zaki?
Ontario Ministry of Education.
Okay, yeah. That's a great question, and you know, it's so hard to compress everything into a short time period, especially at the end of the day. But of course, I want to say that I painted a somewhat dire picture, but of course there's amazing things going on in classrooms all over the country, and I see them all the time. The main thing is that a lot of them, there are teachers everywhere, and of course professors, teaching critical thinking in all kinds of creative ways, teaching creativity and imagination, but they're doing it, they tend to do it in a boutique kind of way rather than a systematic kind of way. They're doing it in spite of the school reform constraints that are put on them rather than because of school reform, right? And I'd like to see it more standardized. Manitoba and Saskatchewan and Prince Edward Island are three provinces that for a great long time actually resisted this standardization and testing onslaught. And as a result, were able to preserve a lot of their curriculum, and in some places in Alberta as well. Ontario is one of the worst case examples. The Ontario model is one that patterned itself the most closely to what was going on in the US. I'm from the US, as Lisa pointed out, and I usually spend a lot of time taking shots at the US, but it's so easy right now that it seemed silly. But we've seen this run the course in the US, right? And now people are actually, the tide is turning. And so the good news is that just as things seep from K-12 education to higher education, things also seep from the south of the border up into Canada. They take on a kinder, gentler form, and they take hold here. And one of those was this obsession with testing and assessment in only math and literacy. Ontario most closely modeled itself, although they hate when I say this because they want to distinguish themselves from the high-stakes testing that takes place in the US, and it is true, they don't have high-stakes testing, but they have enormous amount of the school curriculum is devoted towards preparing kids for taking those tests, and a huge emphasis on math and literacy. So we can look to our neighbors to the south to see what's coming. In the south right now, there are huge opt-out movements, which is that parents are actually fed up with the curriculum being hijacked by this testing all the time. And so there are movements now that push back, right? But there are classrooms in every province, and I can certainly, if you contact me by email or Twitter, I can show you places that are doing it. There's no province or no city or no town where there aren't teachers doing amazing things along these lines.
Yes, and please do tell us who you are and where you're from.
Does this work? Yes. Okay, so I am Sandra Lapointe, and I am from McMaster University. And I have a question. So in my dream fantasy world, I have a dream fantasy university president. And he listens or she listens to your speech, and she says, yes, absolutely. He's absolutely right. And so we need to promote humanities and social sciences. We need to promote critical thinking. It's a bad idea to starve the humanities. It's a bad idea. And then she goes back home, and then she wakes up the next morning, and she says, oh, yes, 90% of my funding comes from industry, so I can't really. So, I mean, I would like to be able to make an argument to this person who's working under certain constraints as to not only the value of forming citizens, but also the value of forming future participants in the industry and in civil life that will need skills that are essentially democratic skills for their jobs. Can you tell us something about that?
Yeah, thanks, Sandra. I have to say, I've heard people talk about it, and Sandra, you're alluding to it, and I heard in the panel that you were on, the idea that actually, hello, science people and industry people, it turns out people in the workforce do need skills in critical thinking, and when they have a base in humanities and other things, they do better in the workforce, right? On the one hand, woo-hoo, that's fantastic, so philosophy is still needed, right, or English is still needed. On the other hand, I become greatly concerned with hitching our train to the idea that it's the reason we should have it in higher ed is because it will help people in the workplace. Because then you are vulnerable to the notion that the second someone comes out with a study that says that that doesn't help raise scores on standardized tests or help someone in the workplace or do whatever, then you've sold out the foundation under which you write, right? I think that we can make those cases here and there occasionally, but I think we have to build the case, the very strong case, that education is not exclusively about preparing people for the workforce. It's not public education's role, otherwise it wouldn't be public education. It is for the public good, right? If there are particular skills that are required in the workplace, then companies are perfectly willing and able, or should be willing and able, to train people in those particular skills. Of course, we expect everyone to graduate with basic skills. This is also a red herring, right? People say, oh God, Westheimer, that progressive educator, he wants kids, he doesn't care about whether kids learn anything. He just wants them to sit around a campfire and sing Kumbaya or something, right? And so, let me get that out of the way. Can you raise your hand if you're a member of the group Educators and Parents Against Kids Knowing How to Read, right? Right? These groups don't exist. I mean, this is like the biggest straw man argument I've ever heard. There are no teachers or professors or university administrators who don't care whether kids have basic skills. We all care about that. But we care about a lot more than that, right? We want kids not just to know how to read, but to know what's worth reading and how it relates to their world outside of school. And when we hitch our goals to the idea that, well, yes, it is, we're useful to the workplace too, I get worried, right? The other thing I wanted to say, I've forgotten. Just rephrase your question again, because you said.
I think I just wanted to have an argument.
Yeah.
I'm satisfied with it.
Right, for saying it. There was one other thing I wanted to say. Okay, well, it'll come back to me. Anyway, yeah, thanks.
We've got another hand up over on this side of the room. Tell us who you are, please.
Hi, my name is Shaina Rivdeen. I'm with Wood Green Community Services. I'd like to preface my question with 3 very short statements. On one of the previous panels, someone said, probably half jokingly, but there's probably something there. 97% of folks in Canada live with some form of trauma, and the 3%, they lie. A report, that was the first point. The second point is a report that was revealed, I think last month, claimed that last year alone, 25,000 post-secondary students attempted suicide. The third point is, having spoken with post-secondary education educators from different countries, just friends, UK, South Africa, the States over here, that the large majority of consultation time that professors have with students actually involve counseling. It has sometimes very little to do with academics, but counseling. So my question is, in the connection between education, preparing someone for the workforce, and I suppose engaged citizenry, what's the role of healing? And in addition to that, the attention that should be paid to things like mental health.
Yeah. So that's great, because it gives me an opportunity to say that, part of the fallout, I framed this whole talk in the idea that if we only focus on job skills and career training, we're going to threaten Canadian democracy because of participation. But what you just brought up is a whole other frame that I think is equally valid, which is we are experiencing a crisis among youth in North America of meaning and sense of connection or purpose in their lives. We have record numbers of kids who report they feel alienated, exhausted, burnt out, and without a sense of meaning. And the other beautiful thing about aiming education towards the notion of democratic participation is that that's how people find meaning. I don't mean that everyone has to get involved in politics per se, but in finding the things that are meaningful to them. And the literary theorist Amanda Anderson said that she thinks literary theory should be primarily concerned with the question of how should I live? And I think in some ways education reform, educators and institutions of higher education and K-12 education should be concerned with that question, how should I live, right? Because that's what gives people meaning in their lives. And we all know that some of our most meaningful experiences are working with other people collectively on a common project to change something in the world for the better. We have record levels of prescriptions of antidepressants. We have skyrocketing diagnosis rate for a disease called ODD. Does anyone know what that stands for? Oppositional defiance disorder. This is a disorder that is characterized by children and young adults who talk back to authority, who reflexively disagree, and this was changed in the DSM-5, but it was in the DSM-4. It said, who become outraged even when outrage is warranted, right? And oppositional defiance disorder, it's diagnosed in, before the period of school reform that I'm talking about, it had a diagnosis rate of somewhere between 1% and 2%, which already seems weirdly high. It now, in some school districts and some cities and locations, it's as high as 20%, 1 in 5 kids. And the way that ODD is treated is either with cognitive behavioral therapy, antidepressant or anti-anxiety medication, and sometimes stronger psychotropic drugs. And it's diagnosed in children. You're not going to believe me when I tell you this, because I didn't believe it when I read it, and I keep looking at it. It's diagnosed in children as young as 3. Okay, oppositional defiance disorder. There was a teacher in Oregon whose name was Norm Diamond, who said that he actually he wanted to coin his own disease. He called it CAD, and it was compliance acquiescence disorder. And he said that it's characterized by people who always do what they're told, who believe the commercial media, and so forth, and who fail to become outraged when outrage is warranted, right? And in some ways, you know, we might have an epidemic of that on our hands. So I really like that you brought up this mental health question, because I think it's intricately tied to the idea that we need a broad-based education that touches kids' thoughts and feelings and skills and abilities about meaning in their life, and about how to find purpose and connection with others, rather than how to get ahead or become an entrepreneur, or at least not exclusively about how to get ahead and become an entrepreneur, because we know from many, many psychological studies that that's a dead-end road for a sense of alienation. And I know I just blabbed on for a long time, but I'll just say one quick thing, because I remember the other thing I wanted to say to Sandra, which was this, and I won't even explain, but I think it's worth talking about at some point, is the financial dependency on corporations and outside interests, which of course university administrators feel. It's not like there's some evil, you know, they're not like tobacco executives. You know, university administrators are not sitting in some room plotting how to make students, you know, mindless rule followers, or right. They're trying to balance all the pressures on them, and funding is a big one. And you know, in a totally different context, I talk about something I call fictive austerity, because we all operate under this idea that we are. In my radio show, one of the most frequent questions I get is, you know, Joel, how come in this time of austerity, what would you cut in public education? And I disagree with the major premise, right? I don't know who necessarily declared this time of austerity, but you know, public funding is about making choices and priorities, about how we tax people, how we spend, what we spend on, and where our priorities are. There's not some great study that came out that said, oh, by the way, Canada wasn't in a time of austerity before, but now all of a sudden we're in a time of austerity, right? It's about choices. It's about public policy choices, and we need to address the reasons why public education should be extremely high on those list of choices.
Yes, there's another question over here. Can we get a mic? Raise your hand high. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I appreciate your comments, and I'm quite concerned about what I'm hearing from you and others about what's going on in K-12. But I am not particularly happy about the dialogue that I hear, the language that I hear that creates such opposition between the notion of preparing oneself to be a contributing member of society through employment or through building a business, as if that's antithetical to being a productive member of a democratic society. I'm sorry, it's not. Actually, I'm not at all sorry, it's not. Many of us get our sense of purpose in life from the work we do, and I suggest that that's particularly true for people who work in universities. And yes, we have academic careers. There's not a difference between what we do in the academy and what people outside the academy do in terms of value to society as a whole. We do have for-profit organizations and not-for-profit organizations, but please, let's stop building the walls between and making false choices. We ought to be able to do it all.
Thanks for that. I don't think it's a false choice. There's no one, you're not going to find anyone who doesn't think that universities should prepare people to be able to get a job and be productive, contributing members of society. There is no one arguing that people should only take philosophy or only take something that, and leave them unemployed when they graduate. There is simply no one who talks that, but you need to follow the money, okay? There is a reason to talk back to the idea that the purpose of university is for employability and job training, because when you don't do that, money dominates the conversation. And you can follow the money by seeing how universities, the percentage of their budget that has shifted over the last 15 years through research initiatives and corporations investing in, instead of doing research in-house, they can now co-opt universities to do that research for them. They also will then control the agenda of that research, and they will control the curricular objectives of higher education. So while I absolutely agree with you that we can have a conversation where we say all these things are important, the last 15 years proves or shows that when we go down the route of, oh my God, what we need to be devoting our time to is making sure that people have the skill, these vague skills that we're not sure what they are exactly for the workforce, because what happens is that we see university departments in the humanities and in some in the social sciences being closed because they are not producing research that is patentable and that is compatible with corporate interests. So I absolutely welcome your idea that we would like to get along and all pursue the same goals. Unfortunately, one side of that conversation has completely dominated and completely forced out through money the other side of the conversation.
We've got some more questions over here. Yes,
Hi,
please tell us who you are.
John Corlett. I'm from MacEwan University in Edmonton. I hope this question makes sense. It's my attempt at non-standardized testing. If you and Ken Robinson were having dinner at an education conference, would you agree a lot, disagree a lot, generally meander around and come to some other conclusions?
I just had dinner with Ken Robinson at a it was Ken Robinson, Pasi Sahlberg, me, and Alfie Cohn, who's also an advocate of this in the US. Yes, Ken Robinson and I would agree on a lot. His focus is on creativity and the importance of creative thinking. And he likes to also poke fun at education reform in showing that we're still in a sort of 19th century model of what knowledge is. And we would be in agreement on that. His focus is more about the arts and creativity, which I think is one component of what it means to be an educated citizen. But he would do more emphasis on that. But absolutely, we would and do agree and have conversations about that.
And I think I saw another hand up over here, yes? Oh, okay, great.
Hi there, my name's Val Walker. I work at the Business Council of Canada. I'm not standing up to justify corporate Canada's role in post-secondary education. Maybe we can talk about that over a drink later. My question actually sitting at the back of the room here as you were speaking, which was fantastic, watching the heads nodding, certainly agreeing with what you're talking about standards versus standardization. And so as someone who pays taxes, as some way of shepherding the public funds and the public purse strings, what instead? Instead of having government, probably it's not going to go over well for them to say, don't worry about it, we're not going to worry about these tests, trust us that we're educating your kids in the right way. How do you provide some accountability in an alternative, more creative, more all-encompassing way?
That's great. So let me start by just saying something, because I think before we run out of time, I absolutely want to say this. Nothing I'm saying should mean that there shouldn't be partnerships between universities and private institutions, whether they're corporations or NGOs or other groups in society, right? And also, nothing I'm saying should be taken to mean that I think that the people within corporations and business groups and business roundtables have a kind of, are all filled with some kind of nefarious plot to make students mindless factory workers so that they obey the rules and become productive. It's not that simple. If it were, it would be easier to stop, right? What we're talking about is a cultural shift that has made us all focus on the streetlight of accountability and of job training and of measures, right? It's not just education, right? Some people call it the metricization of everything, health outcomes, everything else, that steers our attention away from other important goals that involve more complex, difficult to document things like human relationships and other things, right? So what I'm talking about here is a cultural shift, not attacking particular players, although there's some that I would. But it is worth thinking about how we can work together with all those players as long as everyone's interests include the broad goals of education in a democratic society, right? And so to answer your immediate question, which is what can we do, right? So if we're not going to report test scores and we're not going to report on these other metrics, what can we do? Well, there are many alternative forms of assessment. So I will say that, and I know that some of you heard in a couple of sessions about alternative assessments. There's things like portfolio assessment. I've seen schools There's a whole network of schools in the US called the Coalition of Essential Schools, where they do something called exhibitions. Portfolio assessment means like an artist carries a portfolio of their best work. Students collect their best work over a period of 6 months or a year or 2 years or their entire high school career or in college or in university or wherever else, right? And they collect their best work, right? And then they do an exhibition in front of teachers, professors, community members, principals, whoever it is, right? To show what they've been doing, right? What they've learned. The focus is on not trying to find out what students don't know, but finding out what they know and what they've been doing. That's just one example. It's called portfolio assessment. But I also want to say that some things can't be assessed well, right? And yet, I don't want to make the analogy to pornography, but it's just such a good phrase, right? We don't know how to measure whether something is pornography, but we all know it's pornography when we see it, right? Well, so not to put these in the same camp, but it's very difficult to measure with some kind of certainty what good teaching is. But many of us, when we walk into a classroom and walk around and spend some time there, know when it's good teaching, right? And it isn't generally only that kids are sitting in rows and being really quiet, right? We look at what's on the walls in the schools, who's being recognized. We know it. So a lot of what I think we should be directing our policy attention to is at the K-12 level, it's about attracting the best possible people to the job, creating working conditions that will attract the best possible people to the job and make their job as doable as possible. Teaching is one of the hardest professions that there is. And then get out of their way. Once you've got these trusted professionals, get out of their way and let them do their job, right? At the higher education level, I think we are already a little more towards that. And of course, we want some form of accountability, but I also think we need to recognize that if we can create good conditions for learning, for teaching and learning, and then allow people to engage in those tasks with things that we know work, then we'll be better off than if we focus exclusively on assessment. That said, I do think there are alternative forms of assessment that would be useful in these contexts.
I'm so sorry to have to close this off. We've run out of time. I know we didn't get to everyone, including my question, but we might be able to catch Joel on his way out at the end of the conference. I just want to thank you so much for participating.
Sorry, Lisa, I just wanted to say I'm also easy to find and easy to reach. I'll stay here right now. I'm happy to have more conversations and tell me everything you disagreed with and all of that. And I'm on Twitter is an easy way to find me. At Joel Westheimer. Also, if you look me up at University of Ottawa, you'll find my email and everything else.
Well, thank you, Joel, for an amazing wrap-up to what has been a really stimulating couple of days. And thank you to the Conference Board of Canada for bringing us all together and involving the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences. I will ask Matthew to come back up to the podium to send us on our way. Thank you so much.